There is a watch. Gold, heavy, engraved with 3 initials. It was pulled from the North Atlantic in the spring of 1912, still fastened inside the life jacket of a drowned man, the richest man aboard the most famous ship in the world. When they returned it to his son, the boy took it in his hand, and he never let it go. He carried it for the rest of his life. 47 more years. Think about that. A watch recovered from your father's frozen body, and you keep it in your pocket every single day until you die. That boy was Vincent Astor, and by the time his father's watch stopped mattering to anyone but him, he owned a piece of nearly every important street in New York City. He owned hotels the whole world had heard of. He owned a yacht that a president of the United States sailed on to escape his enemies. He could buy a building, a magazine, an island, a favor, a name. He could buy almost anything. And yet here is the question this film is going to spend the next hour trying to answer. How does a man who owned half of New York, a man whose signature could move millions, end his life in nearly empty rooms with hardly anyone left who loved him? He had everything money could reach. So what was it, exactly, that he never once managed to buy? Keep the watch in mind. We'll come back to it. To understand the loneliness, you have to start with the wealth, because in the Astor family, the two were braided together from the very beginning. William Vincent Astor was born in New York City on the 15th of November, 1891. From his first breath, he belonged to the closest thing America had to royalty. The Astor fortune was almost a century old by then, and everyone in the country seemed to know the story of how it started. A German immigrant named John Jacob Astor, arriving after the Revolution with next to nothing, building a fortune first in the fur trade and then, more shrewdly, in Manhattan dirt. He bought land when land was cheap and he refused to sell, and as the city swelled up around those parcels, the rent rolled in like a tide that never went out. By the middle of the 19th century, the Astors were said to be the richest family in America. That was the world Vincent was born into. Not a family so much as an institution. Picture the houses. Marble halls so cavernous your footsteps came back to you. Ceilings painted like European churches. Rooms a child was not meant to touch. Tended by staff a child was not meant to befriend. This was money as architecture. Money you could get lost inside. And a small boy could get very lost indeed. His parents were John Jacob Astor IV and Ava Lowell Willing, a celebrated Philadelphia beauty. On paper, it was a magnificent match. In practice, it was, by most accounts, a cold and unhappy marriage. Vincent's father was a restless, awkward man himself, an inventor and a builder more comfortable with machines and blueprints than with people. His mother was glamorous, sharp-tongued, and ambitious in the ruthless way that Gilded Age society demanded of its women. Neither of them, by the accounts that survive, was especially warm toward the shy, gangly boy who did not grow up handsome and did not grow up charming. We should be careful here. We can't climb inside a childhood 130 years gone and know exactly how it felt. But the outline is consistent across the sources. Vincent was an awkward child, too tall, too quiet, too aware that he did not sparkle the way his world expected an Astor to sparkle. He was raised, as children of that class were, largely by servants and tutors, shuttled between the Fifth Avenue mansion and the family's country estate at Ferncliff, up the Hudson at Rhinebeck. He had a younger sister, Alice, who by most accounts drew more of their mother's affection. And when the marriage of his parents finally cracked apart in divorce, when Vincent was still a teenager, it did what divorce in that airless society always did. It happened behind closed doors, in whispers, in the language of lawyers, and the children were expected to absorb it without complaint and without comfort. So they sent him away, as they did, off to St. George's School in Rhode Island, then up to Harvard in 1911. And here you can start to see the shape of the whole life forming. A boy at the center of unimaginable privilege, and somehow, at the same time, standing just outside the window of ordinary human warmth. Everyone knew his name. Almost no one, it seems, truly knew him. He was 20 years old, an undergraduate, not yet finished with school, not yet finished with being young. His father had recently remarried, a teenage bride younger than Vincent's own sister, a scandal that had set the whole of society clucking. And in the spring of 1912, that father and that new young wife boarded a brand new ocean liner in Southampton to sail home to New York. Vincent stayed behind at school. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. He did not yet know that a message was already racing toward him across the wires. A message that would end his boyhood in a single sentence and hand him the largest fortune in America before he was old enough to fully understand what it would cost him. The ship was the Titanic. You know the ending. On the night of the 14th of April, 1912, 4 days out of Southampton, the largest moving object ever built by human hands struck an iceberg in the dark and, in a little over 2 hours, went down by the head into water so cold it stopped a heart in minutes. Aboard her, in first class, was John Jacob Astor IV, the richest passenger on the richest deck of the most luxurious ship in the world. His young wife, Madeline, pregnant, was placed into a lifeboat and survived. He was not. By the accounts of those last hours, he helped his wife into the boat, stepped back, and waited on the sloping deck with the other men who would not be leaving. His body was recovered a week later by a cable ship sent north to gather the dead. They knew him by the initials sewn into his jacket. And in his pockets, among his effects, was money and papers and a gold pocket watch. Now travel back down the wire to a young man at Harvard. We don't need to invent his reaction to feel the weight of it. Somewhere in those gray April days, the news reached Vincent Astor that his father was dead, not quietly, not privately, but as the lead story on the front page of every newspaper in the country. His grief, if he was allowed to feel it as grief, arrived pre-packaged as spectacle. The whole world was reading about his loss over breakfast. And in the same stroke, in that same instant, the machinery of the fortune turned toward him. Vincent was the eldest son. Under his father's will, the bulk of the estate came to him. And the estate was staggering. The most commonly cited figure is that Vincent inherited roughly $69 million out of a total estate later appraised at around $85 million. Whatever the precise number, translate the shock of it. A 20-year-old college student, overnight, became one of the wealthiest men on the face of the earth. He inherited hotels the whole world knew. The St. Regis and the Waldorf Astoria, both built by the father now at the bottom of the ocean. He inherited whole districts of Manhattan real estate, the rents of a city flowing toward one young man's accounts. He inherited the country house, the yacht, the name, the burden, all of it in an afternoon. He did not go back to finish his degree. There was no time to be a student anymore. He left Harvard without graduating and stepped into the role that had fallen on him, head of the House of Astor at 20. And among everything he received, the buildings, the land, the millions, there was one small object that mattered to him more than any of it: the gold watch, his father's watch, pulled from the sea. His half-brother would grow up resenting that the keepsake had gone to Vincent and not to him. But Vincent kept it, wound it, carried it. For the rest of his life, that watch would sit against him, ticking, a private funeral he attended every single day. Here is the reversal that will define everything that follows. The world looked at this young man and saw the luckiest heir alive, handed a kingdom before he'd earned a wrinkle. But look closer at what actually happened in that spring of 1912. He didn't gain a fortune. He lost a father and was handed a fortune in exchange, as though the two were the same currency. They were not the same currency, and it would take him the rest of his life to learn the difference. A difference he could feel long before he could name it. If loneliness was the private truth of Vincent Astor's life, competence was the public one. And it's worth being fair to the man. He was very good at the thing he'd been handed. He could easily have been a wastrel. History is thick with heirs who inherited an empire and spent a lifetime setting fire to it. The idle rich who drank and gambled and gave the family name to scandal. Vincent was something rarer. He took the machine his ancestors had built, and instead of merely living off it, he ran it. He worked. He set about modernizing the family's holdings with a control that bordered on the obsessive. The old Astor way had been simple and cold. Own the land, collect the rent, change nothing, feel nothing. Vincent was more restless than that. He developed properties, reshaped them, involved himself in the details of what the family owned and where the city was going. He read the map of New York the way his great-great-grandfather had, as a thing that would only grow and grow toward whoever was patient enough to already own the ground. And he pushed outward, beyond the land. He took board seats and directorships across the arteries of American business: the Chase Bank, Western Union, the United States Lines. In 1937, he moved into publishing, folding a struggling magazine he backed, called Today, into another struggling magazine called Newsweek. And out of that merger came a genuine national rival to Time. Vincent Astor served as its chairman, and he held that chair until the end of his life. Then there was the sea, which may have been the one place he was ever truly at ease. Astor loved yachts, and he built himself a magnificent one. The Nourmahal, more than 260 feet of gleaming steel, 11 staterooms, a crew of over 40. It was less a pleasure boat than a small private navy. He took it on genuine expeditions, to the Galapagos, to distant waters, collecting rare animals and, in a detail that tells you something gentle about the man, donating tortoises and other creatures to the Bronx Zoo. He became Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. On the open water, commanding his own vessel, surrounded by a crew who answered to him and could not leave, he seems to have found a version of company he could tolerate. Notice that. Even his happiest setting was a controlled one, a world he owned, staffed by people who were paid to be there. It's a pattern that will keep repeating. Vincent Astor could organize almost anything: a merger, an expedition, an empire, a city block. What he could never quite organize was the one thing that can't be commanded into existence: affection that isn't on the payroll. By his 40s, he was, on paper, a triumph. He had proven he was more than his father's death and his great-grandfather's luck. He had built. He had multiplied. He had made the Astor name mean modern power and not just old money. And it still wasn't enough to fill the rooms. But in the years just ahead, this remote and difficult man would form the single closest bond of his entire life, with a person almost no one could get close to either. A man who would soon be the most powerful human being on the planet. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Vincent Astor were, in a sense, neighbors of the river. The Roosevelt home at Hyde Park and the Astor estate at Rhinebeck sat only a few miles apart on the Hudson, among the same patrician families of the same valley. They had known each other for years. And when the awkward billionaire and the magnetic future president fell into friendship, it became the defining relationship of Vincent Astor's public life. The bond went back to the First World War. Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, encouraged Vincent to join up, and Vincent did. He served in the Navy, lending his yacht to the war effort, taking a commission. It was the beginning of a pattern that would last decades. Whenever the country needed the Astor fortune, the Astor connections, or the Astor yacht, Vincent said yes, and Roosevelt was very often the man doing the asking. When Roosevelt reached the White House in 1933, that friendship became something remarkable. The President of the United States went on cruises aboard Vincent Astor's yacht. He fished from its deck. He rested there, away from Washington, away from the crush of the office, in the company of Astor and a small circle of wealthy, trusted friends, a group that swirled, only half-jokingly, around the name of the yacht itself. For a man like Vincent, who had spent his whole life just outside the window of belonging, this was the view from inside. His friend was the most powerful person in the world, and his friend chose to spend leisure hours on Vincent's boat, in Vincent's company, trusting Vincent's discretion. And Vincent gave that trust something to do. In the years before the Second World War, he became, quietly, one of Roosevelt's private eyes. He gathered information. He sailed the Nourmahal on at least one discreet civilian intelligence errand across the Pacific, gauging Japanese activity in distant island waters. He organized an informal circle of well-connected men in New York who traded intelligence on world affairs, meeting in a plain apartment far from any letterhead. When war came, he was given a role coordinating the port of New York and the flow of intelligence through the city. The merchant convoys, the harbor, the secrets. This was the peak of the public man. Rich, useful, trusted at the highest level, moving through the machinery of national power with an ease he never found in an ordinary drawing room. If you had photographed Vincent Astor's life in the late 1930s, you would have called it a portrait of a man who had it all. And then, in April of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. The country lost a president. Vincent Astor lost the one friendship that had ever fully warmed him, the person, more than any wife, who had let him in. By most accounts, he was never quite the same afterward. The friendship had given his solitude a purpose and a shape. It had connected his enormous private world to something larger than himself. When Roosevelt was gone, that connection went with him. The difficult, remote streak in Astor's nature, always there, always waiting, had nothing now to push against. And it began, which leaves us with the part of his life he could never delegate, never modernize, never buy his way out of. Because a man can have a president for a friend and still come home, at the end of the day, to a marriage with the heat switched off. 3 times he tried. 3 times. Turn the camera now away from the empire and toward the rooms where the empire didn't matter. Vincent Astor married 3 times. He fathered no children. And the story of why begins with a cruelty almost too neat to be true on his own wedding day. In April of 1914, at around 22, he married Helen Dinsmore Huntington, cultured, musical, a patron of the opera. And on the day of the ceremony itself, by the account that has followed him down through every telling of his life, Vincent came down with the mumps. In an adult man, that illness can cause sterility, and by most accounts, that is exactly what it did to him. Sit with the timing of it. On the very day he began his first marriage, the day meant to start a family line stretching into the future, the illness that would ensure he never fathered a child was already burning through him. The heir to the greatest fortune in America was made unable to produce an heir on his wedding day. The marriage to Helen lasted a long time on paper, more than a quarter century, but it seems to have gone cold long before it ended. They moved in the same rarefied world. They simply weren't, by the accounts that survive, close within it. Her own friends described her in private with a knowing wink that suggested her heart was never really Vincent's to begin with. In 1940, they divorced, and Helen soon married a friend of Vincent's own circle. The first attempt was over. Almost immediately, he tried again. He married Mary Benedict Cushing, Minnie, one of the celebrated Cushing sisters, a trio of women who married into some of the most powerful families in America. Minnie was warm, artistic, sociable. She was, in many ways, everything Vincent was not, and perhaps that was the hope. It curdled. And here the sources become quietly damning. Vincent Astor, they tell us, was a difficult man to be married to. Remote, quick-tempered, given to arguments he seemed unable to stop himself from starting. By the later years of that second marriage, his own wife, by most accounts, had begun to refuse to go out with him in public, worn down by his temper and the scenes he would make. Picture that. A man who owned the finest hotels and tables in New York, and a wife who would rather stay home than be seen across one of them from him. The marriage to Minnie ended in 1953. And the way it ended is the single strangest, saddest anecdote in the whole of Vincent Astor's life. A story told so often in society that it has hardened into legend, and you should treat it as legend rather than gospel. As the story goes, Vincent agreed to let Minnie divorce him only on one condition, that she first find him a replacement wife. That she, in effect, recruit the next Mrs. Astor before she was permitted to leave. As the tale was passed around, the first woman approached is supposed to have turned him down with astonishing bluntness, telling this immensely rich man, to his face, that she didn't even like him. He is said to have answered that it hardly mattered, because he was unwell and couldn't be expected to live very long, at which point she would inherit his millions. And the story ends with her reply, the line that has outlived nearly everything else about him. What if you do live? Whether every word of that is true or not, look at the shape of it. Even at the end of a marriage, Vincent Astor is reaching for the only tool he ever fully trusted. He is treating companionship as a transaction, a thing to be arranged, negotiated, and, if necessary, purchased with the promise of an inheritance. He does not know how to be chosen. He only knows how to be paid for. Even here, he leads with the fortune, because the fortune is the only part of himself he was ever sure anyone wanted. And so we come to the third wife. In October of 1953, weeks after the second divorce, Vincent Astor married Roberta Brooke Russell, a woman the world would eventually know simply as Brooke Astor. She had already lived a full life, once divorced, once widowed, a working woman who had actually held a magazine job, warm and witty and socially gifted in exactly the ways he was not. By most accounts, she was Minnie's own suggestion, the replacement found and delivered, which means the great love story at the end of Vincent Astor's life may have begun as an arrangement, a recruitment, a favor between a departing wife and a lonely, aging man. And yet, of the three, this was the one that held. For the handful of years he had left, Brooke stayed. She would later write and speak, with a striking honesty, about how hard he could be to live with. The difficulty was real, and she never pretended otherwise. But she stayed. Together they began shaping the thing that would, in the end, be the closest Vincent Astor ever came to being remembered with love, the foundation that would carry his name and give his fortune away. He had, at last, someone beside him. What he didn't yet know was how little time was left for her to be there, and that the fortune he'd spent a lifetime accumulating would only truly connect with another human being after he was gone, in hands that were not his own. The last chapter of a lonely life tends not to have events in it. That's what makes it lonely. And so the later years of Vincent Astor are, in a way, defined by what stops happening. The president was dead. The intelligence work had wound down. The great construction of the empire was long since built. Vincent was a rich, aging man in a city he half owned, and the days had less and less in them that required him. By most accounts, he grew more withdrawn as he aged, more antisocial, harder to be near. The temper that had emptied the seat across from him at dinner didn't soften with the years. He was known, in the New York of his time, as a difficult man, respected, certainly, feared a little, courted for his money and his power, but not, it seems, warmly loved by many. The two things almost never traveled together in his life. People wanted what he had. That is a very different thing from wanting him, and there is a particular ache in the fact of the children he never had. He was the eldest son of the eldest son, the keeper of a name that stretched back through American history, and the line simply stopped at him. He would be the last Astor to hold the family's great estate on the Hudson. No sons to inherit it, no daughters to fill it. The house that had passed from Astorman to Astorman for the better part of a century reached Vincent and found no one on the other side of him to pass to. Nor did he make peace where he might have. He had a younger half-brother. The child, his father's young widow, had been carrying on the Titanic, born 4 months after the sinking, forever known as the Titanic baby. Vincent despised him. The resentment ran so deep that Vincent reportedly questioned, cruelly and without basis, whether the boy was even truly an Astor at all. He would ultimately cut him out entirely. Whatever wound Vincent carried from that spring in 1912, he never set it down. He carried it the way he carried the watch, every day, against his body, for the rest of his life. Try to picture the ordinary evening of it. One of the richest men in America, in a beautiful apartment on the East Side, with everything a fortune can arrange within arm's reach. And around it, silence. Not the peaceful kind, the other kind. The kind that comes from a life in which almost every relationship was, at some level, a transaction, and transactions do not sit with you at the end of the day. He had spent nearly 50 years proving that money could buy, build, expand, and control. And in these last quiet rooms, he was living out the one lesson it could not teach him, the lesson the watch had been ticking out against his chest since he was 20, that you cannot purchase your way back to the warmth you were never given and never quite learned how to give. And then, near the end, the past came back for him in the strangest way. By the account that has attached itself to his death, one of Vincent Astor's heart attacks. An early warning of the one that would eventually kill him struck him as he was walking into a movie theater. The film he had come to see was called A Night to Remember. It was a recreation, careful and unflinching, of the sinking of the Titanic. 46 years after the sea took his father, Vincent Astor's own heart faltered at the door of a darkened room where the ship was going down. The image is almost unbearably fitting. The wound that opened his adult life life was still there at the close of it, still capable of reaching up out of the cold water and taking hold of him. He did not have long after that. Vincent Astor died on the 3rd of February, 1959, of a heart attack in his apartment in New York City. He was 67 years old. He died more or less as he had lived the private half of his life, quietly, without a crowd, in expensive and largely empty rooms. The newspapers ran the obituaries a rich man's death demands. The city noted the passing of one of its landlords, its power brokers, its last great Astors. And then the question that always comes for such men arrived in its turn. Where does all of it go? He had made his answer years before. In 1948, he had established the Vincent Astor Foundation, and he had given it a motto plain enough to be a confession: the alleviation of human misery. When he died, the great bulk of his fortune, an estate valued, by most accounts, at well over $100 million, passed onward, in large part, into that foundation and into the hands of the one person who had stayed. His widow, Brooke Astor, inherited both a great deal of money and something more consequential: control of the foundation and the freedom to decide what a lifetime's Astor fortune would finally mean. And this is where the story turns, where the bittersweet payoff to the whole long, cold life quietly arrives. Because Brooke did with Vincent's money the one thing Vincent himself never managed to do with anything. She used it to connect. For decades after his death, she carried that fortune out into New York City in person, not from a distance, not through intermediaries. She went to the places the money went: the branch libraries, the parks, the housing, the small institutions in neighborhoods a Gilded Age Astor would never have set foot in. She insisted on seeing the human being at the far end of every check. She gave away well over $100 million, and she gave it with a warmth and a visibility that made her one of the most beloved figures in the life of the city. She turned the Astor name, at long last, into something people felt affection for. Not envy, not resentment, but affection. She lived to 105. And when she died, in 2007, the fortune that had begun in a fur trader's ledgers and passed down through a lonely man's careful hands had been transformed, in the end, into something like public love. Which brings us back, as promised, to the watch. Remember the question we opened on. How does a man who owned half of New York die with almost no one beside him? We can answer it now, and the answer was there in his pocket the entire time. The watch was recovered from the body of the father whose death made Vincent rich. From the very first day of his fortune, wealth and loss were fused into a single object. The same object. He carried them together, literally, against his heart, for 47 years. He spent his life proving that money can build an empire, sway a president, raise a skyline, and command a crew. And he proved, without ever meaning to, the harder thing underneath it, that money buys everything except the one possession he wanted most, and the one he could never quite name. It took his widow, and his fortune, and 30 more years after he was gone, to finally spend that money on the thing he never could. Connection. Warmth. A name that people loved. Vincent Astor owned nearly everything a man can own, and in the end, the richest gift he ever gave was the one he had to die before anyone could open.